Hey guys, my name is Cedric, aka the Curly Coder. I am 32 years old and work as a professional software developer, specialized in designing and maintaining mobile and web applications. But it has always been a dream of mine to create my own indie game and to publish it on Steam eventually. So I try to learn as much as I can in the spare free time that I have, and I was able to work on multiple different projects in the last couple of years. But none of them were ever really in a playable state, mainly because of my neurotic perfectionism. Perfectionism. Murdering my dreams since 1993. Anyways. In this video I want to show you the recent progress on my latest project idea. An automation game called Mistletoe Inc. It's a game where you have to play as Santa Claus, and you have to save Christmas by using the magical powers of capitalism. It was another quite big investment of time and energy I had to commit myself to. But this time I had a strategy. If I really wanted to do this, I would need to come up with a solid concept. Focus on the essentials. Actually get things done. And try to ignore the fact that I suck at making game art and that the sprites will look like a colorblind toddler made them. At least for quite a while. So how exactly did it go? I'd say let's kick this devlog off by starting with in the beginning I had a few rough ideas, but it took me a couple of weeks to finally come up with something that actually made sense. And there are still open questions that need to be answered in due time. But I don't think that's a problem, at least not for now. In fact, the opposite is true in my opinion. The concept is solid enough to start with implementation, but there are still plenty of opportunities to expand on it and build new ideas around it. The main premise is that Santa is in a lot of trouble. The polar ice caps were melted as a result of global warming. He had to leave behind his iconic workshop at the North Pole and move all the way south to Antarctica. And since then, business hasn't been good for old Santa. One by one his elves left him and found new, more lucrative jobs in the private sector. And on top of all that, during an evening poker game with all the other magical creatures, Santa has a few too many cups of eggnog and loses way more than he has to his evil nemesis, the Tooth Fairy. That sparkling childhood trauma-made flesh now demands every penny back from Santa if he wants to keep his business. This is the main objective of the game: pay back Santa's debt to the Tooth Fairy. But this won't be an easy task. Since most of Earth's natural resources have already been claimed by humanity, and he finds himself broke and alone, Santa has to come up with a plan. He remembers the frozen forest, a magical and dangerous place where the elves originally came from. There are enough resources and elven workers there to get the production of Christmas presents up and running again, and to earn the coins Santa needs to repay his debt. But a powerful and mystical force reigns in the frozen forest. Every year at Christmas, a magical storm sweeps through it, completely transforming the surroundings. The elves call this event Snowmageddon. Moreover, time works differently there than in the real world. Only the magical creatures that live in the forest can find their way around it for longer periods of time. This makes it practically impossible for Santa to set up a permanent workshop there. Instead, throughout the year, he must return to the frozen forest time and again, plan expeditions and the construction of small factories, and then link their capacities together via a logistics network to ensure continuous production of Christmas presents. This is the central game loop. Start expeditions into the frozen forest, find resources, produce Christmas presents, and earn coins. Santa's workshop serves as a central hub that tracks meta progression across expeditions. Every time Santa returns to his workshop, he can use the resources he brings back from the frozen forest to construct new buildings or research technologies. Any leftover coins can be used to hire elves for Santa's crew. Elves are highly skilled craftsmen whose help Santa will need if he wants to scale up his production in the long run. They can accompany him on expeditions into the frozen forest, handling the gathering of resources, the transport, and the manufacturing of intermediates and Christmas presents. So far, so good. But what's still missing are obstacles. Something to put the player under pressure. I have plenty of ideas on this topic, ranging from a quota that must be met by Christmas, to hordes of biter-like enemies that make the player's life in the frozen forest more difficult. None of these ideas are 100% fleshed out yet, which is why I'd like to revisit them in a future devlog. But feel free to discuss your ideas in the comments down below. So what I had at this point was already enough to implement many key components, which is why I felt confident enough to get started on the implementation of I started by creating the 4 scenes where everything would take place, as well as a game state machine script whose job would be to manage the transition between the scenes. The boot scene, as you can guess by the name, is the entry point into the application. It initializes the game and directs the player to the main menu scene, where I put together a basic user interface that allows him to start a new game. Starting a new game allows you to configure a seed that is then fed into the random number generator used by the code. This way, every randomly generated world can be deterministically reproduced using said seed. As soon as the game starts, the player is taken to the workshop scene. The 4th and last scene is the sector scene, which loads when the player selects a sector on the world map and launches an expedition there. I'll get to this specific scene in a couple minutes. I decided to start generating the world map at the beginning of the workshop scene. This way, the generation would already be complete before the player opens it for the first time. The world map is made out of hex tiles, each of which is assigned a biome, such as tundra, grassland, or mountains. To generate the terrain, I use noise maps that are layered on top of one another. By layering multiple noise maps, it's easier to represent different aspects of terrain generation. In the end, we have a world map generated randomly based on the seed we entered, which looks natural and seamless. Next, it was time to create some graphics for the individual biomes. I know, I wanted to focus on the essentials and stay away from game art, but in the long run it would have frustrated me to just stare at monochrome boxes and placeholders all the time. It's probably more enjoyable for you too. And this way, you can witness my pathetic attempts at creating the sprites with your own eyes. Yeah, I know. It's bad. Anyways, after a few hours of work, I was finally satisfied with the state of the world map, so it was time to think about our protagonist. For inspiration purposes, I had AI generate an image, which I then used as a basis to create my own sprites for Santa. I will never be incorporating AI generated graphics into my games as is. Pinky promise. My own creations might look a bit shabby, but at least there's a creative process behind them. But I think it's okay to use them as orientation. Feel free to disagree in the comments. After about 4 hours, I had all the individual parts of Santa put together. You might be wondering why I didn't just create him as a complete graphic right away. I had been thinking that the players might want to be able to customize their Santas, so I wanted to be prepared. Since I needed a place to test Santa's movement, my next step was to create a map for the workshop. I tried to learn how to build the sprites for seamless grid tiles using YouTube tutorials, but I quickly hit a wall. So I decided to go with single color tiles for the time being. The workshop map I created on my first attempt was, of course, way too big and way too over the top for something I would need to completely redesign 5 hours later anyway. I set up a spawn point for Santa and wrote a simple controller script to make the old man move. However, the terrain in the workshop was still purely visual at that point, which is why Santa could walk across the water for the time being. Also, when the game started, the camera zoomed in extremely close to Santa's beard, which was both funny and intimidating at the same time. I tried once again to make the terrain tiles look seamless. I really didn't want to get distracted and focus on the essentials, but this issue was robbing me of my sleep. I tried several different methods, and after a few hours of frustratingly having to paint new variations of the same patch of grass over and over again, I finally found something that worked. The logic behind Unity's rule tiles was also a bit confusing at first, but once I got the hang of it, my grass finally came together like magic. It was a proud moment for me because honestly, deep down I had believed I would fail at this. Nice indeed. I created additional rule tiles for the other types of grass as well as for the different types of snow. By assigning each variation its own tile map, I can layer them on top of one another to create a nice gradient effect. At that point, it dawned on me that the workshop map I had created was far too large for a prototype, so I scaled it down significantly. I got distracted once again, this time by the question of whether I could implement walls, using the same sprite pattern I'd used for the terrain. It didn't really work out at first. The sprites didn't line up properly. The tileset I had drawn was useless and had cost me a total of 3 hours. But I had a feeling that I wasn't too far from a solution, so I invested another 2 hours in a new tileset. In the end, this is what I came up with. Say hi to my walls. Since I had a good run going, I decided to create sprites for a wooden floor as well. My first attempt didn't look particularly impressive, but at least it worked to some extent, so I decided to leave it at that for now and focus on working on Santa's movement instead. Now that I had tiles for wooden walls, I started by assigning colliders to Santa and the walls, so that Santa could no longer move past them. Even at that point, however, it was clear to me that this couldn't be the long-term solution I was looking for. While the colliders would reliably block Santa's movement, I felt that in the long run I needed a system that worked much more dynamically. You see, if a wall is placed on a tile, it must not only block movement, but also prevent the placement of other objects. Additionally, the player must interact with these objects in various ways, to use or harvest them, for example. Sorting the sprites was also giving me trouble. I wanted Santa to be rendered in front of the wall when he was standing in front of it, and behind it when he was standing behind it. But at that point in time, I didn't have a satisfying solution for either problem, so I implemented a few workarounds for the time being and got back to working on the game loop again. I created the first object, a map table that the player can interact with to open the world map. Do you remember the world map? Yeah, we took a couple detours, but we're finally back where we started. I wanted to display a tooltip whenever Santa is near the map table. To do this, I first created this neat little scroll sprite and then found a suitable Christmas-themed font online. The font is called Enderbrush, in case anyone's interested. But for some reason, using that scroll as the background for the tooltip did not really convince me. Instead, I came up with this idea, a thought bubble, with an animated keyboard button showing the player what to do to interact with the table. Now that we were finally able to open the world map, the next step would be to actually make it interactable and give the player the ability to select a sector for their next expedition. I painted a banner with Santa's face on it, which would serve as a marker for the selected sector. After that, I reused that scroll sprite from earlier since I wanted it as the background for the sector selection overlay. This new overlay is where the player will later be able to look into all the important information about this sector, in order to choose the best destination for his next expedition. For now though, I've only added some placeholder data to get a feel for the layout, icons and font sizes. I also added a few buttons and tinkered around a bit with their colors and placement. But in the end, I came up with a much better idea for how the buttons should look, and I think you will agree with me when I say that now they give the scroll in the background just that little something extra. I connected the new overlay to the world map and modified the code so that it would remember the selected sector even after the map was closed. Now I needed a second object that Santa could interact with to start the expedition into the selected sector. I decided to go with Santa's iconic sleigh. Fun fact, I didn't know how to spell the word sleigh because I'm stupid. And German, but mainly stupid. So when I searched online for Santa's sleigh, I was quite confused to see pictures of movies about a killer Santa pop up in the results. And thank goodness I'd come up with that smart plan early on to focus on the essentials. Because after I'd already spent several hours painting that damn sleigh and it still looked like crap, I naturally kept at it for several more hours and nearly drove myself crazy in the process. That's why I'm actually a little proud of how it turned out in the end. It's nothing extraordinary, but it will fulfill its purpose. And it's also something I never would have thought I was capable of. And that's what makes it special. For the sleigh, I created the Expedition Overview overlay, which looks exactly like the sector selection overlay, so I was able to simply copy most of it. In this case, however, a small adjustment was needed, since it should only be possible to start a new expedition after the player selected a sector on the world map. Once the player launches a new expedition, he leaves the workshop scene and enters the sector scene, where a randomly generated sector map awaits him. And with that, I had implemented roughly half of the central game loop. I decided to take another small detour and clean up the main menu. The simple design from the very beginning was bound to become obsolete eventually, so I adjusted the layout a bit to match that of the new overlays. I also created a temporary logo for the game, and I added a button that would open a link to my YouTube channel when clicked. But then it was finally time to move on to the second half of the game loop. Each sector had to be generated randomly, based on its biome, so I wrote a script to handle the generation and rendering of the sector map. There were still a few rough spots here and there where the terrain sprites overlapped strangely, but it was good enough for now. Next, Santa had to spawn on the sector map. Of course, this shouldn't happen on blocked terrain, so the code selects a walkable spot and, just to be safe, regenerates the map if no suitable spot can be found. After about 3 hours of work, old Santa was wandering around in a randomly generated sector map. The map was still limited to a small fixed area though, so the next step was procedural generation. I sliced it up into chunks measuring 32 by 32 tiles. Only chunks near Santa are actually loaded. As he moves in a certain direction, new chunks are loaded ahead of him, while those behind him are destroyed. This was already pretty nice, but up to that point, the sector map still looked very empty. So the next step was to create a few objects to be placed randomly on the map. But there was still an obstacle standing in my way, one that I had already mentioned earlier. The map table and Santa's sleigh were just sprites with a collider, with no actual connection to the grid system. Now I had gotten to a point where this was no longer enough. I needed a more dynamic solution that would allow me to place the created objects both manually in the workshop scene via editor mode and randomly in the sector scene during runtime. At the same time, a placed object would need to manipulate the data of the grid automatically, to block tiles for example. For the workshop scene, I created a custom brush that I could use in the editor, just as I had used one of the existing brushes for terrain tiles. With this new custom brush, I was able to read the data for any given object, such as its size, the central tile, or the tiles blocked for movement, and automatically process this data during placement. The code for the sector generation then used the same data when placing objects randomly. I also added logic that could detect which tiles were already occupied by placed objects, preventing new objects from spawning there. Trees, for example, occupy a 3x3 area, so another tree can only spawn at least 3 tiles away from it, because otherwise their areas would overlap. This dynamic approach will be extremely useful in the future. If, for example, the player wants to place a building on the map and we need to check if something is blocking its construction site, we can use the same logic again. Then I solved another minor problem that had been giving me a headache for a while. By creating new sprites for the tree objects that consisted of multiple parts, I was able to make Santa disappear behind them. The trick is to ensure that the parts of the sprite in front of which Santa is supposed to be rendered cover the block tiles as completely as possible, like in this case the stump. Also, Santa's pivot needs to be set correctly, otherwise his feet will stick out. The end result isn't 100% perfect, but it's already much better than the previous implementation. The new trees were a nice addition to our sector map, but they were still purely decorative. However, Santa needed to be able to cut them down and harvest wood from them, so our next step was to make them interactable. To mark an object as interactive, when the player hovers over it with the mouse, I wanted to draw a colored outline around the object's sprite. Since the trees, for example, are made out of multiple sprites, I decided against simply creating new graphics with colored outlines. Instead, I made an exception here and used an AI agent to generate a shader for these outlines. I really don't know anything about shaders, and building up that knowledge would have clearly taken me too much time. If it had been something extravagant, like realistic lightning or fire effects, I probably would have bought something from the asset store. But I think with something as simple as this, I can let a machine do the work for once. Not to mention that the shader is far from perfect. AI can only get you so far. From that point on, it's just you and your brain. But as I mentioned earlier, feel free to discuss this topic in the comments. The shader ended up working well enough. It displays a yellow outline around the object when Santa is close enough to interact with it, and a red outline when he's too far away. Now I wanted to give Santa the ability to cut down one of those trees and harvest wood from it. To do that, however, he would first need an inventory where he could store the collected materials. I had already created a few overlays, the sector selection and the expedition overview, which had been sitting in the workshop scene up until now. So I decided it was time to make everything a little bit more dynamic. The existing overlays were saved as prefabs, and from that point on, a special overlay manager script handled the opening and closing of the individual overlays in each scene. After that, I was finally able to start building a simple inventory overlay that renders a set number of slots and displays the type and quantity of the material occupying said slots. If they aren't empty, of course. Then I created a script to harvest an object for resources. Just like in Factorio, Santa has to be near the object being harvested, and the player has to hold down the left mouse button to perform the harvesting action. Once the process is complete, the collected materials are placed in Santa's inventory, and the object is destroyed. Of course, the entire process needed a progress bar to show how much longer the harvest would take, so I implemented one. But at that point, I decided I had to take a step back. I had written a lot of code and implemented some fairly complex logic, such as procedural sector generation. But even though everything was working so far, the code was of less than ideal quality. There was hardly any documentation, some confusing connections between classes, no proper project structure, and inconsistent naming conventions. I had worked quick to make progress, but at the expense of quality. And I had to deal with this before the technical debt made it virtually impossible to continue working on the project. So I sat down to refactor everything. I went through every file, line by line, added documentation, and inserted logs at strategically important points. I revised the naming conventions for functions and variables and made the code clear enough that I'd still be able to understand it in 2 years from now. It took a while, but the hard work will pay off tenfold in the future and save me a lot of time and energy when building new features or maintaining existing ones. Once that was done, I worked on a few optional ideas, mainly to see how quickly new objects and materials could be integrated into the game. In the end, I had a few rocks that Santa could mine for stone and coal, as well as a few patches of grass that were purely decorative. The next topic was a bit higher on my priority list: loading screens. When the workshop scene or the sector scene initially start, scripts are executed to generate the world or the sector map. Up until this point, these processes were synchronous, meaning the game would pause for the duration of the generation. I wanted them to be asynchronous, so that I could track the current progress and show it to the player via a progress bar. Now that everything looked a lot cleaner, it was finally time to wrap this up and close the central game loop. First, I added a heads-up display to the workshop and sector scene. In the sector scene's HUD, I placed a button that allows the player to return to Santa's workshop at any time. The world map that had already been generated, as well as the contents of Santa's inventory, are preserved, so that the player can bring collected materials back to the workshop. The new button also came with a new confirmation dialog that asks the player if he really wants to perform the requested action. Next, I added an overview to the workshop's HUD that displayed Santa's current balance in coins. At first, I considered showing his debt balance there as well, but I decided to build a separate overlay for this purpose instead. We still needed a place to display the controls for selling collected materials and paying off debts anyway. I even added hotkeys to the sales menu, so that a single click would sell 1 unit of a material, while a click with the control key held down would sell half of the available materials, and a click with the shift key held down would sell the entire amount. This finally closed the game loop, and the result was already very satisfying. It felt nice to see the green number go up as I sold off gathered materials, and the red number go down as the debt was paid off. But there were still 2 things missing before I could consider this milestone achieved. The first of those things was a game menu that could be accessed by pressing the escape key. This menu would later allow the player to save the game or load a previous save, as well as adjust settings or quit the run and return to the main menu. The other thing was a victory overlay that displays a message to the player once he has fully paid off his debt to the Tooth Fairy. And that was it. Now let's see the final result. I know there's still a lot of work to be done here. There are still some small bugs, and I've already started collecting everything I notice on a Scrum board. And I will fix each bug one by one. At the same time, however, a lot has already been achieved that can be built upon and expanded. That's a solid foundation to build on, and I'm really looking forward to see how things turn out in the end. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this ride. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you're curious to see how the project progresses, feel free to subscribe to my channel. Also, I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas in the comments. Indie games thrive on input from a passionate community, and I enjoy my work a lot more when I get constructive feedback. The next episodes will likely be a bit shorter. I plan to share my progress in smaller increments, so I can go into more detail about the individual features. A few of the items that are next on my to-do list are a crafting menu, building machines and structures, multilingual support, and, sooner rather than later, a system for loading and saving a game. Is there anything else you'd like to see? If so, let me know in the comments and I'll take it into account when planning the next milestones. Until then, thanks for watching and I see you next time.